Please welcome Head of Remote at Gitlab, Darren Murph, in conversation with Skift founder and CEO, Rafat Ali.
All right, well, I'm back after that long break. Hey, Darren. So finally, we get you on stage. We have known each other for many, many years. And you are, I think, the most quoted man in all of humanity today on the future of work. And you also happen to have the sexiest title. I was saying Chief Remote Officer. Turns out it's Head of Remote, not Chief Remote Officer. You should talk to your boss and change it to Chief Remote Officer, because that sounds much better. Anyway, thank you for being here. For those of you of the people who don't know GitLab, just explain the company and the size of it.
Yeah, so we're a DevOps platform delivered as a single application. We have over 1,300 people in more than 67 countries, and we were all remote from the start. So wow. GitLab began as an idea in 2011 and was more formally incorporated in 2014. And we've been all remote without any company offices since the very beginning. And by the way, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course. And so, and you joined recently, I would say within the last year, right?
Yeah, I joined mid-2019 and began assembling what we now know as the remote playbook. We have over 40 guides on how we do everything on remote work. We're an open core company, so all of that information is open sourced. And I began methodically building that as an internal and an external resource, and then COVID happened. And it turned out it was very useful for all of that information to exist. And so now a lot of it has been translated to become what is the blueprint for many companies who are suddenly remote and they are in the transitionary phase.
In fact, you're offering a certification for people who want to take that I guess, course, right? Is that a course now as well?
Yep, that's correct. So if you Google GitLab Learning Certificate, you'll see that you can dig through our guides and actually earn a certification in GitLab remote work. And also stay tuned tomorrow for a formal announcement on the curriculum.
Please, this is live. You can break it here.
I know it is coming tomorrow, but we will have some big news to share on the remote work education front, and it will be available to all.
Okay, so I guess Skift, which is a company that has gone completely remote, much like you, obviously much smaller, through this pandemic, and will continue to be so. And your history has been in travel. The thing that's interesting to us, obviously, you've been in the travel industry for a long time, have been in the edges of tech as well, and obviously in the tech industry now. Yeah. What is the head of remote's job at GitLab? And you've also talked about why companies should have a head of remote.
Yeah, it is far and away the most cross-functional role in the entire company. It's the remote voice in the room. It's keeping an eye on inclusivity on all decisions that are made across finance, legal, HR. Everything is connected. And what companies are starting to realize is that if you just look at the remote compensation angle, or if you just look at equitable perks and amenities, they have a domino effect on everything else, from morale to talent branding to your eventual Glassdoor reviews. Remote is very nuanced, and it's a complex thing to unravel, especially for companies that were formed as a co-located firm and are now trying to figure out how to transition. There's a multitude of challenges, and it makes sense to have a singular role, because this person can be responsible for making sure that you don't push one lever that then activates 6 or 7 that you're not aware of. So my role is predominantly helping people who join GitLab to acclimate well to remote. It's curating and developing our educational resources, working with learning and development to develop curriculum around that, and being a part of all of our future moves, from compensation to marketing to communications. There's a lot that happens. More recently, I've been developing an asynchronous workflow guideline to convey out across the entire organization and help us move forward and become a more asynchronous organization. That's just one example. We're always evolving and remote. It's not a destination. It is a journey of iteration. And so even GitLab is continually getting better at remote work.
And you've talked about, I've listened to a bunch of your interviews over the last few months, and you've talked about the nirvana of remote work is asynchronous work.
Yeah.
Explain what that means, and is it it seems like it's more possible in tech companies, software companies, less in other companies, but talk about what that means.
Yeah, so quickly, currently, I wouldn't say we're in the nirvana of remote work. What we are seeing right now is crisis-induced work from home.
Right.
which is very different than intentionally structured remote work. Even for me, I have not been able to work remotely for the past 6 months. I've been able to work from home, but that is not the same as remote work. Having the freedom and flexibility to change locations and engross yourself in a place and a culture where you can be the most productive. And so even for seasoned remote veterans, what we are experiencing over the past 6 months, it is definitely suffocating to some degree. And I think all of us are eager to get back out there and explore new frontiers or old frontiers, as it may be. But in terms of asynchronous, yes, it is arguably the holy grail of remote work. It requires a few prerequisites. You have to have a documentarian culture. And also it helps if you have digital outputs. So a newsroom or a technology company, obviously much more amenable to asynchronous. But at its core, asynchronous work is useful because it's very efficient. So you can stop the torturous loop of meetings to just bring each other up to speed. But also it's very inclusive. You can move a project forward without having to bother someone. So if you are continually working synchronously, what ends up happening is you fit your life into the work schedule.
Mm-hmm.
But if you fully embrace asynchronous, you can fit work into your life schedule, which at scale across a large organization and over time creates much happier, more productive people who are freer to think creatively. So the longer this goes on and the more you embrace it, the easier it is for your company to have a competitive advantage around those who do not embrace that.
And so you've used the word inclusive a few times already. Do you believe inherently that remote companies who do this well are more inclusive because of the reasons that you said?
Yeah, I do think so. It's easier to get true diversity, geographic and cultural diversity, two types of diversity that aren't talked about as much. It's easier to get that natively. So you could have a company that's based in Phoenix, for example, and you could have a goal to hire someone from every country in the world. And if you met that goal, it would look great on paper. But given 6 or 12 months, all of those people would essentially become Americans. They would use American money, American cell phones, vote on American politics. To some degree, they would acclimate to their environment. But in an all remote setting where you truly hire people where they are and enable them to stay there, you then have people in various places around the world. And that cultural diversity and that perspective pours back into your product as well as how people treat each other.
So talk about sort of how a job gets posted, because like basically if you're saying 67 countries, is that what you said, 67?
Yep, that's right.
So like, let's say you're going to post a job tomorrow. What does this say? It says anywhere in the world, and you get millions of resumes. I'm guessing you have systems and softwares to sort of weed out some of the stuff, and then you don't make a decision based on where anybody. You don't make a decision of looking at resumes based on where anybody's based, correct?
So it's not completely location agnostic for every role. There are still some guardrails in that. If we need, for example, someone who specializes in tax law in a certain region or country of the world, we will try to hire them there. But then within that region, they'll have maximum latitude on where they can work. And honestly, remote has been such an amazing competitive advantage that we've switched earlier this year to an outbound recruiting model. And so while our jobs are posted, we enable people to join our talent community, but we actually have our sourcers and recruiters specifically trained to go find people in places of the world where most other recruiters and sourcers won't look. We want to actively go after the hidden talent, people that may have been ostracized from the working world. We're talking about working parents or underrepresented groups or military spouses or people that have had to move to a certain place for elder care. These people have essentially opted out of the workforce because they can't or they're unwilling to move to a major urban center of the world, but they have an amazing amount of genius to contribute. That is the type of person that we want to go after and find, because those people are incredibly loyal to companies that truly enable and support remote work.
So once a person is hired, let's say they're in Kenya, for example, they could, up to them, move anywhere. I mean, obviously not these days, but move anywhere where they want, right?
There is that option. Gitlab maintains a list of countries and regions where we can't hire for various reasons, trade embargoes and things like that. But outside of that, yes, we give people the freedom to move, and we have people that take advantage of that. It's incredible to see at GitLab. There are some people who want to work remotely and they really don't have any ambitions to go travel the world. And there are others that quite literally work out of an RV, and every day you'll see them on a Zoom call with a different national park or background in the back. So it spans the full gamut. I think there's this preconceived notion that anyone who's a remote worker is automatically a digital nomad and you'll just find them on a beach in Bali. But having worked with 1,300 remote workers, that's not really the case. Some people do have that lifestyle, but it's usually more in between. And what's really beautiful on the travel side is that it simply enables people to travel more with less judgment. People can fly on a Tuesday and their upgrades will clear. If people have family that are visiting and it's the holidays, they're able to fly a few weeks early and avoid the peak prices. It's small things that really add up to just giving people more freedom to travel and work and intertwine those in a way that's really not possible in a co-located job.
So hybrid, a lot of companies are talking about hybrid, which is some people are remote. I mean, hybrid companies have obviously existed forever. Yeah. Some of the companies are saying, well, we're working from home now, but when we come back, we'll have sort of a co-working type space and or at least it'll be hybrid arrangement. Is hybrid the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds?
So that's an interesting question. I don't think it's either. I don't think it's it's a 1 or 0 type binary type question. I think all remote is the purest form of remote work, but hybrid is something that can be made to function. It's not like it's going to be a failure guaranteed. It just requires an amazing amount of intentionality. At its core, when you have people that are on-site by default and off-site by default, you have two different playing fields. So someone has to be responsible for trying to make those playing fields as level and as equitable as possible, hence the need for a head of remote. And also travel plays significantly into this. For companies that are transitioning to a hybrid environment, you have to understand that those who are offsite by default are going to want human connection at some point. We are communal relational beings. The goal coming out of COVID should not be to figure out a way to onboard new employees without them ever seeing another human. That is not the solve. We're trying to solve for a world where travel restrictions are lifted and we can be humans again. And so what ends up happening is travel becomes a core part of culture building. Even at GitLab, we get our entire company together every year for a summit called GitLab Contribute. We get all of us in one city. Most of it is just optional excursions, time for people to bond and build relationships. That's really meaningful. And it's so meaningful that when we onboard people, we give them an IOU of when the next one is so they can mark it on their calendar and look forward to it.
So in a fully remote company like yours, is there more business travel or less business travel?
It depends on the department. In sales and field marketing, there's a lot of travel, and we tend to attract people who really love where they live, but it usually isn't a city, but they also love travel. So we get people that are super passionate about racking up airline miles. They just want to live an hour or two away from a major airport so that they can be near friends or family or be in a community that matters to them. But what we also see is people have a lot more freedom and flexibility to interject leisure travel. So how I see this happening or changing going forward is that business travel should get a lot more dynamic. I think some of the remote years of the world, for example, are going to pivot to being co-working experiences. You're going to have teams of 10, 50, 100 people that now suddenly need an offsite every quarter or so to build strategy, to build bonds, to build relationships. And so instead of catering directly to digital nomads, they may cater more towards corporates who have a need to pick a point on a map, fly their team there, do a little bit of team building, do a little bit of bonding, but also experience a new place for the first time. So I'm really excited about how this post-COVID world is going to impact business travel. And my hope is that it becomes a lot more exciting than it's been in the past.
But do you see a certain percent of business travel going away forever?
I do. There are certainly some instances where flying 16 hours to have a 2-hour meeting no longer makes sense. But think about what you could do with the 32 combined hours of travel that you save. So if you aren't using it for that, you could get a lot more creative on weaving travel into your company culture. A lot of executives are burnt out on business travel because a 16-hour trip for a 2-hour meeting is a pretty poor ratio. But imagine if they did not do as much of that. It would open up more opportunities for shorter, more spontaneous trips to spend time with people.
So we at Skift have been, and this is I've been working on this sort of thread or essay in my head on when the future of work meets the future of travel. You mentioned Remote Year, which I don't know if people caught the reference. Remote Year is a company that exists, has gone through the ups and downs of being a startup. Selena is another company that is there that actually has these hostels, different places you can stay. Digital nomad is another term you used. Some of the countries are starting digital nomad visa. Some had already, Estonia and others. Barbados and a few other Caribbean countries and other countries are exploring. Thailand had this thing as well. Do you see sort of these digital nomad visas becoming the norm going ahead?
I do. I think they're significant on a number of levels. One, even for people who don't want to take advantage of them, it sends a clear signal that that location is very welcoming to tourism. So it sends a signal right away that you will be welcome there. You will be appreciated. You could expect warm hospitality. You could expect people going out of their way to make sure that you feel like a part of the community when you arrive. So even for people who don't take advantage of it, it's really smart from a country marketing perspective to have something like that, because it sends a very positive signal to anyone who may consider visiting that part of the world. But I think more broadly, what this does is it further democratizes remote work and substantiates it as something that is legitimate. To some degree, digital nomadism and this picture of a remote worker just being on a beach in Bali has watered down what a remote worker actually is. It makes it seem like they're one type of person and they don't have to work all day and they're not really contributing meaningfully to society. And that's not actually what
Plus, like real human beings with families and kids and schooling and all the other stuff.
Correct. And so I think with these visas, it's just another thing on the democratization of remote work that I believe will, on the whole, really help underrepresented groups. One thing that I want to see happen on the other side of this is the ability for anyone to walk into a job interview and boldly ask, what is your stance on workplace flexibility? In prior years, this was a very privileged question to ask. You needed to be at a certain place in your career and have a certain portfolio of work to be bold enough to ask something like that in a job interview when the job was posted directly for New York City or for San Francisco. Because if you had travel in your blood and you wanted to make that a part of your life, it's very hard to convey that to a company or a manager who was already set in their ways on the notion of remote work. So my hope coming out of this is it allows people that really see travel as a part of a boost in their productivity to bring that up at the table without it being so taboo.
Actually, I forgot to ask you this. Where are you based?
So I'm based in coastal North Carolina, so far from a tech hub. I've spent probably 3 to 5 years of my life combined between San Francisco and New York. I still have BART cards and MTA cards. I don't know if the funds are still active given how long it's been since I've been there. But nevertheless, I tried to consider myself somewhat of a global citizen, far away from those tech hubs so that I wasn't fully drinking the Kool-Aid of any given region in the world. But I love travel, and I really do miss being able to keep touch with those various cultures. It all plays into what makes me me. And I'm really eager to get back out on the road.
Question that's coming from the audience. How can you keep creative minds together on a remote mode? We find it exhausting. Some person asked this question who says they find it exhausting. How can you keep creative minds together in a remote mode? Like the spark of humans together.
Yeah. So I want to acknowledge the current scenario, which is you're trying to create or foster creativity in a suddenly remote team that was catalyzed by a pandemic. And why I say that is it is hard for anyone to be creative right now. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. There are a lot of stressors that none of us have previously had to deal with. So I want to be careful not to conflate remote work with why it is hard to be creative. The other reality is most companies who have transitioned to remote are in what I consider phase 1 of remote adaptation, which is skeuomorphism. That is essentially pressing copy on the office environment and trying to paste it into a virtual environment. So if you're doing that, you're probably in nonstop Zoom calls where you feel compelled to look into the camera for 8 straight hours a day. And then after that, you have to also be a teacher's aide and help with your virtual schooling that's inevitably going on. And then also do email and all of the other things. And it's very difficult to operate in an environment like that. So You need to first of all get past COVID and then start planning for a more asynchronous future. At GitLab, we foster innovation by writing things down. When we have ideas that come to mind, we document them, we write them down, and then we open them up to broad feedback instead of calling a meeting. And it is amazing what happens to your creative flow and your mental health if you could reduce your synchronous meetings by even 50%. So there's a guide in the GitLab handbook on that. If you Google GitLab phases of remote adaptation, you'll find a full guide on that. Great question, though. You are not alone. A lot of people, a lot of teams, and a lot of leaders are going through this same thing. And
this writing culture that you've said, I know Basecamp. So we just moved to Basecamp. We use Slack. We're phasing out Slack. If anybody from Slack is listening, I'm sorry. We're moving to Basecamp. Basecamp founders have also said this, that the writing culture is very important. This is what I've been trying to evangelize in our company. I think our company is obviously still early days, but we're moving towards that as well. Some people would equate sort of writing culture, documentation. This is like red tape, bureaucracy. I have to write everything down. What would you say to that?
Your time scales are warped. If you think in terms of the next hour, writing something down feels incredibly inefficient. If you think of what it will do in the next year, it's a no-brainer. So we have a long-term mentality that writing something down now makes our tomorrow and next week and next month much more efficient. That has to become woven into the fabric of your culture. And at GitLab, we have many forcing functions to keep us on that straight and narrow. It is not natural. It feels uncomfortable. There's a reason the word force is in forcing function. But essentially, if it doesn't exist in the GitLab handbook, it doesn't exist at all. And so we make it impossible for work to get done if you don't write it down. And that helps. But what ends up happening is people could see that from the outside and think it's bureaucratic or red tape. But in practice, it feels like discipline and cohesion. So it doesn't take long for people who join the company to really start to appreciate discipline and cohesion.
Okay, let's go to some of the other questions here. Curious how you set salaries, cost of living adjustments for remote workers. Do COLAs, cost of living adjustment, change if a worker moves?
So part of GitLab is that we try to answer everything with a link, and I literally mean that. So instead of me rambling on about it, I would encourage you to Google GitLab compensation principles. We have multiple guides on this, laying it out. It's all open source. It tells you everything about what we think about, what we consider, what data we look at. And there's literally an open source calculator that you can look at. You can punch in a few jobs and see what comes out. We're very transparent about that. And we're always monitoring market data to take those shifts into account.
How do you ensure remote workers around the world have access to the same office resources, tools that will set them up for success? I think this is very important for all companies.
This is a great question. It comes back to inclusivity. We pay for people's home offices. So if you have a disability and you need a specific desk or a specific chair, just buy it and expense it to the company. Our policy is spend the company money as if it's your own, and we hire people that are managers of one, and they appreciate that and they don't abuse that. And we're very blessed that that is the case. I will say for companies that are suddenly remote, it's a bit unfortunate for someone who intentionally bought a home out in a rural countryside, for example, that doesn't have access to high-speed internet. And now that is their primary workspace. In GitLab's situation, if you chose to live in a place where you did not have access to high-speed internet, we will reimburse a WeWork or a co-working space, but we would tell you this up front, and it would be something that was discussed in the interview process, and it would be the responsibility of the person to make sure that they could get to a high-speed connection on a daily basis, but GitLab would happily cover that.
Are there certain countries that have more companies supporting remote work and digital nomads? Wondering if we could expect more workforce spending time outside of specific regions than others? Meaning, are there more friendly countries to this than others?
Yeah, I do think so. You can look at the average internet speeds of any given country, and that'll give you a short list of those that are more equipped for it. Also, those that have extensive rail networks are more amenable to it. And in general, there are countries that are just more amenable to couch surfers and those that spend time in coffee shops. I do think this will greatly democratize that. And so the usual pockets of the world, the Thailands and the Balis and all of that, I do think we'll see more. Countries are starting to realize that now this is a marketing campaign.
Right.
And, for better or worse, I do think that will be an impetus for investing in infrastructure that has been ignored for a long time.
Let me end with this. What do you miss about office work? Or I know you haven't been in an office in a long time, but what do you miss about the physicality of work?
The one thing I'll say about hybrid where you should really lean into and take advantage of is work from home after a long time can get old and boring. And I really like getting on a plane to visit offices. And one of the awesome things about remote work is if you're getting on a plane anyway, you can visit your San Francisco office one week, your London office another, your Singapore office another. And I would encourage remote leaders who are trying to figure this transition out, weave that into your go forward plan, weave that into your strategy, make sure that people can get to other offices and visit other people. I miss that, Rafat. I miss going to San Francisco and New York.
You used to travel a lot, right? I remember you, I don't know how many countries you've been, but I know you've been to a lot of countries.
I have over 40 at last count. I'm a million miler on Delta, but outside of a trip last week, this is the closest I've come to a Delta jet. I miss it. I miss it. I love being a tourist in a city that I don't have to be in. It's phenomenal. And I do miss that element of it. I miss the energy that comes with it. I miss the serendipity and the spontaneity of it. Sometimes I even miss the delays. You just want to put your George Clooney hat on and see how you can circumvent whatever issue life throws your way.
I'll wait till you go 3 times from Newark to LaGuardia. I think you won't miss it again. But anyway, thank you again, Darren. That was fascinating, and we could continue this conversation. But thank you for doing this.
Cheers, Rafat. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks.